that are helped annually with all of the government, United Nations, and NGOs collectively working. Last year, we helped about 66,000 people out of 40 million people. That's 0.2% of the victims, not even a 0.5%. And when it comes to the criminals, there's about 500,000 of them around the world. Last year, we put about 7,000 of them in jail. So from this, you can see that the groups of organizations that generally focus on trying to address this issue aren't having much of an impact. And this is why the private sector has been brought into the discussion related to this. So when it comes to kind of the reason why it is that we have so little impact, a lot of it really comes down to the profits generated from modern slavery. It's estimated that the profits annually are about 150 billion US dollars a year, second only to drug trafficking. The amount of money that's used to address this is about 350 million or 0.23%. So we have huge profits, small amount of money relative to these profits that are used to address this. And so governments were basically saying, we need to get the private sector involved because 60% of forced labor associated with supply chains. I'll come back to that in a moment. Okay, so what are some of the things that are being done? Well, one of the things that governments have done is said that we need companies to be more transparent. We need people to know what companies are doing to address modern slavery. So about 10 years ago, we started to see what's called transparency legislation. What this legislation basically does is kind of allows consumers to see what companies are doing or not doing. And so the first legislation was the California Transparency in Supply Chain Act. Basically what this act said was that if you're a big company and you have products in California, you have to put on your website what you're doing to address modern slavery. If you're not doing anything at all, you can say that and you're in compliance, but you have to say something. Then the UK Modern Slavery Act came. That act basically said the same type of thing, that if you're a big company, you have to put on your website what you're doing, but it added two additional factors. Number one, there had to be an annual report, and number two, that annual report had to be signed by the board of directors. Then you saw the Australia Act, which went a little bit further. There's a database where all these statements need to be put on so that people can see them in one place. And you see in Canada and in Germany, acts that will go even further. There will be fines and penalties associated with this. The second thing we were seeing was major lawsuits against companies. So for example, there were some major companies that were sued because they were buying seafood from Thailand. And the plaintiffs were basically saying that seafood is tainted by modern slavery, and as a result of that, they're supporting modern slavery. In one case, they actually, on the side of the tuna fish, wanted there to be a statement saying that this product could be tainted by slavery. You can imagine what that would do to sales related to a particular organization. So not a very good thing. We are seeing lawsuits in the cocoa industry and actually in the hospitality industry in the United States, where if a girl was forced into prostitution and used in a hotel, it would basically, they would sue that particular organization, and many of those lawsuits are being won. The problem with lawsuits is it leads to these stories getting into the newspapers, and then consumers are seeing this, and it creates naming and shaming and has a devastating impact on these organizations. We're seeing a significant increase in media coverage related to modern slavery, almost a doubling every year for the past, I would say, 8 years now. This particular topic is of interest to people. They want to hear about it. They want to know about it. They want to see stories related to this. And so you will anticipate that this will continue for years to come. Lastly, ESG. Now, ESG is the metric that is used by organizations, companies, in order to determine how good they are doing in terms of their relationship with the planet, with communities, with their employees, and so forth. E stands for environmental, S is for social, G is for governance. And so what we're seeing is that a lot of investment companies are beginning to be asked by the people who are investing, how do we know that our investments aren't contributing to modern slavery? How do we know that they are not hurting the planet? How do we know that they're not hurting employees? So as a result of this, there's a lot more emphasis on basically companies stepping up and looking to see whether or not they can look at their own business to determine whether or not they're doing right by the world. You will see ESG significantly increase over time, partly because of COVID. When COVID came along, what it did is it had a significant impact on kind of people's perspectives on the business's role as it relates to doing good. So companies can no longer just focus on profit, prestige, and growth. They now have to focus on doing right by the world, and ESG measures this. If these factors are not taken into consideration by businesses, it could have a devastating impact on their overall bottom line. For example, if a company finds themselves in a forced labor scandal, we've determined after an analysis of around 10 different organizations that can have a devastating impact of close to $64 million of lost in revenue. That's the average that we've come up with. This could result in boycotts. It could result in people not basically buying from a particular company. So this is a significant factor that has to be taken into consideration. Okay, so what are some of the kind of risk factors associated with what's called modern slavery? One of them is a factory that has employees that are indebted. So let's say you had an employee, he lived and worked in Nepal, he was making $30 US a month, and then an agent goes up to him and says, how would you like to make $200? What do I have to do? Well, you have to give me $1,500 US, go to Kathmandu, get training, and then we'll send you to Malaysia. I don't have $1,500. Well, we'll lend it to you. So the person borrows the money, doesn't realize that there are all kinds of fees and interest associated with it. Shortly, $1,500 becomes about $3,000. They end up going to Malaysia, and they work for years in order to pay back the debt. So they're not making more than they were really making before. In fact, they're making less, and they're getting more and more indebted. We see situations where a person signs a contract in one country and then goes to the other country and is forced to sign another agreement. When they were in Nepal, they looked at it, they agreed to it, they signed it. When they get to Malaysia, they see the agreement. It's in another language. They can't understand what the language is. They say, I can't sign it. You sign it or something bad will happen to you is what they're told. So they sign it not realizing that all kinds of penalties and fees and deductions are there. So instead of making $200 US, maybe they make $40. It's a way of cheating people. So these wage deductions are another way of basically kind of cheating people. In some cases, they are charged room and board. They are charged, if they go to the toilet, they are charged for many other things. And that basically reduces their overall weekly fee. In some cases, companies hold on to documentation, and that withholding of documentation forces a person to stay in place. Let's say that Nepalese person wanted to go home. The company says, well, I'm not going to let you go home. I have your documents. You can't leave without them. And so the person has no way of escaping this situation. That particular situation is a means of maintaining a person in place. And lastly, living standards. In some cases, people enter into a work situation where there's 25 people in one room sharing one bathroom, horrendous conditions, no air conditioning, no sanitation. These are all risks of modern slavery. So what I'm going to talk about now are a couple of tools that are being used in order to address these things. Part of the biggest problem is finding out whether or not these things are actually happening in a factory. So the people who are generally most vulnerable are migrants. They come from another country. They come to the destination country. They work, but let's say that they don't speak the language. They have no way of communicating their situation. And so we, the Mekong Club, working with others, the United Nations University, have developed an app that auditors can use. And what the app does is it helps to break down a certain number of things. First of all, if an auditor goes into a factory and can't communicate with the migrants that are there, he or she can't get the information they need. So this app helps to get around that. Secondly, when an auditor sometimes has an interpreter to talk to these particular people, often the manager is standing right beside them, listening to what's saying, so that the The auditor asks a question, the interpreter poses the question to the migrant comes back, and then it's stated to the auditor, and the manager's there. If the manager is basically intimidating that person, by his or her presence, this creates an issue. So a lack of privacy existed. Another thing is a lot of auditors don't know what questions to ask. They don't have the right training in order to know whether or not what they're stating is making a difference. So as a result of all of these factors, the organizations that we worked with said we need a tool to be able to communicate with the most vulnerable people, these migrants. Can you set something up? So we developed what was called the Apprise app. And the way this app works is there are a number of different questionnaire sets that we have that focus on manufacturing. It could focus on sexual exploitation, fishing, a variety of different types of sectors. And what the auditor does is he takes the phone and he puts it in front of the person he's trying to get information with, and there are flags on the front of it, and the person presses the flag from where they come from. With headphones on, they are then told in their language, we are going to ask you some questions. If the answer to the question is yes, press green, no, press red. Do you have a debt? Yes or no, green or red. Are you forced to work overtime without pay? Yes or no? Do you have freedom of movement? As a result of going through these questions in that person's language, we are able to identify the vulnerabilities that exist within that particular location. And as a result of that, we are able to then determine whether or not modern slavery is taking place. This particular tool offers an opportunity for all kinds of data to be collected, the location of the factory, what are the answers to the questions, how much vulnerability exists. And as a result of this particular approach, auditors will have a very clear sense of whether or not there are violations that need to be fixed. Now, why are the brands interested in ensuring that their supply chains are free of modern slavery? Because of the reputational risks that I mentioned earlier. The potential for lawsuits, the potential for naming and shaming in the newspaper, the potential for people identifying issues about a particular factory and about a particular company that could really hurt them and could go hurt their overall business. So having a tool like this offers the opportunity for companies to really be able to address this vulnerability, because once they find it, they can fix it. Another thing that we have developed, and again, this was as a result of private sector companies coming to us and saying one of the biggest problems that we face is migrants going from one country to another, ending up in a factory, and us not knowing whether or not there is any kind of debt associated with them. Now, remember, debt is what holds people in place. If a person is indebted and they're in Malaysia, it really poses a situation where they can be held in place for years. And so what we did is we worked with a number of different organizations. We worked with some of the recruitment agencies to identify what are some of the issues that we see. One of the things we see is this contract substitution that I mentioned earlier, where one contract is signed and then another one is signed later. As a result of not having verification and validation of what that initial contract said, there's limited visibility among the auditors because there isn't a paper trail that shows what was initially signed. As a result of this, it leads to a lack of trust between the recruitment agency, the factory, the brand, and the auditors. This lack of trust needs to be addressed with something. As I mentioned, you could have multiple versions of different agreements. And so what was needed was for there to be a way of ensuring that the initial contract that was signed could not be changed, could not be altered, and would be available not only to the migrant worker, but to the factory as well as to the brands that are auditing these factories. And so we worked with an organization called Diginex, and we developed a blockchain approach that would allow for all the documentation when this process began to be put into a blockchain format. So what happens is the contract is reviewed, If the person doesn't read, it would be read to them, and then it would be signed, and then there would be a photograph that would be taken, that would be put into the blockchain. And as we all know, when you blockchain something, it's immutable. It can't be changed. It can't be altered. It can't be changed in any type way. So this then is available to the worker. So through a password and so forth, and given off to the factory. Now, the organizations that would agree to something like this would be recruitment agencies that want to be perceived as doing the right thing. So if you have a situation where a company, a recruitment agency, takes on this particular tool and says to the world, we care so much about our reputation and our trust that we are going to ensure that whatever is signed by the migrant will stick with the migrant and go forward, it demonstrates that they are a good organization. And what we're seeing as a result of this approach is that these good recruitment agencies are crowding out the ones that are cheating and stealing from the migrants. And so using blockchain technology can make a big difference. The organization that I work with is called the Mekong Club. We work with the private sector in a positive, supportive way. We have an association which includes members that come from banking, from retail, from manufacturing, from hospitality, and we work with them in a positive, supportive way. So these organizations come together on a quarterly basis, and during the time they come together, they debate, they discuss, they identify what needs to be done in order to address modern slavery. So in one case, they said, well, what we need is an e-learning toolkit to allow for companies to be able to educate, their employees. And so we developed a 15-part, 3.5-minute video approach that would allow for these workers to understand what's happening in their own language. We developed analysis of legal systems, of kind of what's happening in supply chains. The point I'm making is this. The private sector has a role in addressing modern slavery. And by them identifying what that role can be, and by us, the organization, the Mekong Club, developing these things, we can develop the tools to protect these businesses from modern slavery. So the two tools that I mentioned, the Apprise app and the eMIN, which is the blockchain technology, were suggested by the private sector to be used by the private sector to protect their business. And this demonstrates how technology can be used in a positive, supportive way to address the potential vulnerabilities that exist within forced labor. With that, I will end my presentation. Thank you very much.
All right, so we're going to take some questions now from Matt. So if you have anything you would like to ask, go ahead and push your question using the Q&A tab located on the right side of your screen. You can also click on the raise hand button, which is at the bottom of your screen. If you want to do that, we can then bring you on stage, and you can ask your question directly using a microphone or webcam. So let me first just cover a few things here. Matt, listening to you, I was also thinking of what is the role of the local immigration authorities or the agencies which are basically controlling those migrant workers. When they come to those countries, they go through a checkpoint, they get checked on their visa. Is the immigration, for example, able today to kind of track or check whether the companies who are hiring have a bad record, or they've been caught before in issues or problem around slavery or labor or illegal labor? Is this system in place at local level with the immigration?
That's a great question. There are different checkpoints that could potentially protect the migrants. For example, in the destination country, they could be looking to see whether or not the factories that they're going to are responsible, have any issues or problems. When they arrive in the destination country, in the source country that happens. In the destination country, they could check to see whether or not, upon arriving in the location, whether or not there's kind of a strong relationship with a factory. Do they meet a particular standard and so forth? But these things happen in silos. And so instead of there being kind of a link between all of these various steps, The immigration people see them, look at their paperwork to determine whether anything's being done. But when it comes to follow-up, it just doesn't happen in most of the countries that we work in. As a result, it's a missed opportunity. The organizations that are supposed to be looking at a lot of the factories would be labor inspectors. But in many locations, labor inspectors, there are insufficient number of them. Many of them are underpaid. In some cases, there is corruption associated with bribes that are paid to them. Not always, there's good ones as well. But this leads to the possibility of a person being in an exploitative situation with no remedy to basically protect them.
So today, in many of those countries, the immigration has no way to check a database where they can, find out whether this company has been involved in the past in some kind of illegal activities. They have no way for them to check.
They don't connect
As long
the
as the
dots
visa,
that way. It's a
don't
really good question because, I mean, if you really wanted to fix the system, you would have, for example, the source country regulators looking at to make sure that prior to these individuals going off to another country to determine whether or not there's any negative news associated with that company.
Yeah.
That's really easy, and there are databases that allow for that to happen. If the immigration people were to link up with the kind of labor inspectors and the auditors so that there was some communication or some database related to that, you would then be able to see whether or not there are some companies that fall into the category of being exploitative or risky. It would be a great program for somebody to set up, but to my knowledge, that doesn't exist.
Okay. We have someone who's actually just raised his hand, LP Sharma. So let me bring LP for him to ask you a question directly. Let's try whether it's working. Go ahead, LP. You can switch on your microphone. Yeah.
Hello.
Yeah. You're live. Go ahead. Yeah.
Max, I think this is really an alarming issue Mr. Matt had raised, and really is very vulnerable and need to be addressed. And what I'm suggesting, because this type of problem we face in every country, because now there is a gap between the employment available and the job seekers. So under the pressure, when somebody needs a job, even in India also, they used to sign even at the labor wages, they sign something and they give something, and even they sign some letter, then they change, then even they play a lot of the roles in this thing. Can we not make a system that maybe we can make a form and we can approach the central international bodies to make a clause in the government that whenever somebody is going to appoint, there must be clause from the factory side that this should be, this problem will not be for the worker. And those clauses made strict that they have to follow. Otherwise, if any complaint comes, normally in India also when complaint comes, inspectors are maybe under, they are paid or they are, these employers, they pay under the table and the issue doesn't come. So there should be some sort of clause in the appointment letter for the industries, which is given by the industry to the workers, that if any of such problem is raised by even one or two or three laborers, there should be strict action, and there should be, the government should come to support the workers. Otherwise, this problem really, it's we have a number of jobs, so we have a multiple times of the workers available. So the gap makes this situation. And
all right.
And under this supply chain council, I think we can raise this issue. We are from different countries, we are professional, so we can raise this issue to international bodies, maybe international leaders, international, maybe some sort of government players, that this clause should be added somewhere in the appointment letters from the government side.
Okay. Matt, you want to react to this?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything you say. There needs to be more systems and procedures in place. There need to be clauses and agreements. The clauses need to be respected. There need to be organizations that address the clauses if a violation takes place. There needs to be more international activity. The problem is that in some cases, many of those things already exist. It's the operationalization of, or the follow-up that is lacking. There is not enough labor inspectors. There is not enough initiative among labor inspectors to go and address these types of things. There are not there's a lot of money that happens under the table, as you rightly point out, that results in basically companies doing things that they know they can get away with because companies have a certain amount of power all over Asia. You know, I didn't want to kind of single out Nepal and Malaysia. The difficulties that I'm talking about happen all over Asia and all over the world, including my country, USA. So, you know, what we're talking about is if a person can or an organization can get away with exploiting workers because they know that the systems and procedures are weak and there's not a lot of follow-up, they're going to do it. And that's really what we're up against. So I totally agree with what you're suggesting. I just wish it was a more robust response when these issues come up.
Okay, let's bring another question here. This is from Michelle, who's based in Hong Kong. She's asking, how can a corporate go through the route of the supply chain to ensure its supplier is not using forced or child labor? Most corporate reveal first or second degree of suppliers, but they have little or no transparency of suppliers down the chain.
Yeah, I mean, this is an issue that we see with many of the organizations that we work with. They have been looking at tier one, which I think is you're calling the first, where the assembly of the item takes place. But the second tier, where the rivets and the zippers and the shoelaces and various other things are in, they haven't been looking at, or the raw material, tier three. And it's partly because nobody had asked them to do that. But now, all of a sudden, the expectation is that as part of legislation related to transparency that I mentioned, you have to go from tier one all the way down to tier three. So that means maybe you're going from 1,500 tier one audits to about 4,000 audits. The question is, well, how are you going to pay for that? Who's going to pay for that? So what we're seeing is that brands are beginning to share information. So if 5 companies are using the same zipper company, one of the companies will audit it, the other one will do shoelaces, the other one. So there's this sharing of data that will allow for more units to be basically audited. So I suspect, and it's not happening yet, within the next 2 or 3 years, most companies will have the expectation of having to go all the way down into their supply chains, tier 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever number they have. It's going to take some adjustment, some creativity, but that's the direction that we're seeing happen.
So you mentioned that they are starting to share their information. Let's take, for example, the fashion sector. Is this already happening, or it's still work in progress? Are all the big garment fashion brands now starting to share their database of thousands of suppliers that they have and on these kind of issues?
Yeah, some people share the information on their websites, so they actually, in a very transparent way, will say these are the factories and the sub-factories we work with. There are exchanges that take place between organizations that basically are working in the same manufacturing geographical locations. It's not the norm yet, but eventually I think it will be. I think it'll be something that organizations have to do in order to be cost effective. Again, if you have to do all those audits yourself, it's very trying. Another approach is that, let's say a company identifies a tier one company that they work with where they're assembling something. They identify all of the tier 2 sites and they do a spot check of a percentage of those to get a general sense of whether they're finding things. Just because it's tier 2 or 3 doesn't mean you're going to find issues. In fact, many cases you won't. But you won't know that unless you kind of put your toe in the water of these particular locations to see whether or not there is any vulnerability that's found. If you find it, then you have to go deeper into it. If you don't, then you know that you're probably okay. But this is the direction a lot of organizations are going in.
Okay. Next question from Giovanni, who's based in India. He's saying, do you have information on the occurrence of this issue on different industry sectors? I would expect that high tech, for example, is less prone to it. So what are the industry where you see the most pressing issues around slavery, for example?
Well, let's talk about high tech. High tech often uses battery technology. We see cobalt and lithium coming out of the Congo. That's highly fraught with child forced labor, and so forth. Eventually, something that is perceived to be good, which is, electricity and electrical components on the green side, could be perceived as a negative on the S side. In kind of the tech world, where you see kind of the large platforms that interact with people, a certain number of people are recruited into forced labor circumstances through these networks. And so as a result of having access to people that can be exploited, they reach out to them through chats or through various tech tools that exist. One other thing that I'll say is that, I was working with a law firm, and the law firm said, after I did a presentation for them, thank you very much, very interesting, but we're a law firm. We don't have any issues that we have to be concerned about. And I said, well, where are you based? Singapore. Have you ever looked at the people who clean your office? Have you ever kind of explored the third-party cleaners? They said no. They looked into it and they came back and they said, well, it was fraught with all kinds of exploitation. So the point is you shine the light on various aspects of businesses, you can find that people are taking advantage of others in a form that would be described as modern slavery.
Let's take a question here from Shandan, who's asking, many IT companies do resort to recruitment discrepancy, like offering higher salaries to person already holding offers from other companies. This is like bargaining. Do you think these are common or needs to be checked?
I think there has to be honesty in the agreements that companies have as they relate to employees. Sometimes a person is promised something and then they get something else. As long as they can leave the situation, it would be a form of exploitation. It wouldn't be considered modern slavery. And let me make this clear what kind of modern slavery is as opposed to just labor exploitation. If a person is tricked and deceived into a situation where once they're there, they can't leave because of debt or threat, and they don't get paid, or they don't get paid sufficient amount of money, that's what we're talking about with modern slavery. So a lot of different forms of exploitations take place, but if the person can walk out that door without any implications associated with it, it's exploitation, not modern slavery. In some cases, what you're describing becomes modern slavery when a debt is incurred or a person's documentation is taken away so that they can't move from place to place. All of these things contribute to basically a modern slavery outcome.
Okay. Maybe we'll finish up with this question. Someone is asking about blockchain again. So what do you think about blockchain can be used to impact you? You kind of talk about it, but the question is, will government embrace this new tech and support it? Yeah.
I can't say for government. I was one of those people that when I first heard about blockchain, I had to watch about 25 of those Blockchain for Dummies films. Couldn't figure it out. Finally sent one of my staff to a blockchain office to have them explain it. We decided we were going to do a project, and then Diginex came to us and we worked with them. Blockchain basically takes information and puts it in a way that it can't be changed. There's a community of individuals that watch it, that check it, and so forth. So it offers transparency. I think 5 years from now, you're going to see a lot of manufacturing blockchaining everything. Staffing levels, staffing time, payments, everything you can possibly imagine, because it offers an opportunity for the auditors to have information that is real, that is tangible, that is allows for them to feel confident that there is no cheating taking place. We hear about blockchain with Bitcoin and so forth. It uses the same basic mechanism, but for the most part, for what we're talking about with supply chains, it really just comes down to locking information in a way that ensures that changes can't be made, and that's a good thing. So I think blockchain is going to be used very extensively. Whether governments take this on, most governments, it takes them a while to catch up to technology like this. I know that some governments that I'm working with are still using paper instead of computers. So I suspect that it will happen, but probably not right away.
With that final note, thank you very much, Matt, for joining us today, sharing your insights and your efforts on, what you're doing related to modern slavery. It was great to have you again. Our next speaker is joining us in just a few minutes. So, don't go anywhere, stick around. We'll be